nobody was supposed to see it. That's the thing about palace protocols, they exist precisely because certain things are never meant to reach the wrong hands. I think, a guard's written account. A time-stamped observation log. A single page tucked inside a leather-bound duty folder that sits, usually, in a locked drawer inside a security office most people don't even know exists. But Kate saw it. And, once she did, nothing about that afternoon at Windsor could be called ordinary again. Let me take you back to a Tuesday in late October. The kind of morning that starts gray and stays gray, where the light never really commits to anything. Windsor Great Park had that particular autumn heaviness to it, damp leaves pressed flat against the gravel paths, the trees stripped down to their bones, a cold that didn't bite so much as settle. I was part of a small media crew that had been granted limited access to the grounds that day for a scheduled photographic session, one of those carefully managed arrangements where you're told exactly where to stand, what lens you can use, and roughly how long you have before someone in a dark coat appears at your elbow and politely tells you time is up. We arrived at 7:30. Set up near the eastern perimeter path. Our brief was simple: document the exterior preparations for an upcoming official engagement. Background shots. I think, architecture. Seasonal color. Routine. Plus, professional. TBH, contained. Except nothing about that morning turned out to be any of those things. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be precise here because I've thought about it many times since, was the guard's posture. I've been around royal protection officers and ceremonial guards long enough to know what composed looks like. These are men and women trained to stand at absolute stillness. They regulate their breathing. They anchor their gaze at a fixed point roughly 6 feet ahead and 12 feet up. They become, in the most functional sense of the word, furniture. This guard wasn't furniture. He was stationed near the side entrance to one of the estate buildings, a door I'd never paid attention to before, painted dark green, set back slightly from the main path. Standard posting. And he was doing all the right things physically, back straight, hands at his sides, chin level. But his eyes were moving. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would catch. Just this faint, almost involuntary drift left, then back, then down toward the path, then up again. Like someone trying very hard not to look at something they'd already decided they couldn't stop thinking about. One of our photographers, a woman named Diane who has an eye for human detail. That honestly, I genuinely envy, leaned over and said quietly, "That one's holding something." Holding what? I asked. She just shook her head slightly, and, don't know. But, watch him. So I watched. For about 20 minutes we worked quietly, moving through our scheduled shots. The morning went on around us the way mornings at Windsor do, hushed, controlled. That particular quality of silence that wealthy old buildings seem to generate all on their own. And, the whole time, the guard barely moved. But, every few minutes, his gaze would settle briefly on that green door, then pull away again. Like a compass needle getting interrupted by interference. At around 9:15, a member of the household staff came through, one of those brisk, purposeful women in dark clothes who always seem to know 3 things simultaneously. She paused near the guard. Said something low, which he responded. She looked at him for just a fraction of a second longer than the exchange required, then moved on. Diane photographed that exchange without making it obvious. Out of professional habit, I think, more than intention. Neither of us thought much of it at the time. The next hour passed unremarkably. Plus, we wrapped our exterior shots by 10:30 and moved inside to document a corridor near the main reception area, high ceilings, oil paintings in heavy gilt frames, that particular smell that very old official buildings have, like beeswax and thyme. And that's when I first heard about the report. Not directly. Not from anyone who had any reason to tell me. But, when you spend enough time in environments built around discretion, you develop an ear for the things being left unsaid in conversations you're technically not part of. 2 members of staff were talking near the far end of the corridor. Voices low. One of them glanced toward us, reassured themselves we were occupied with our equipment, and continued. What I caught, and I caught it because Diane had gone silent beside me in a way. That told me actually, she'd heard it too, was a name. Charlotte, and then, he wrote it all down. The whole thing. By protocol. And then, the other voice, tighter, she's already asked for it. There was a pause. Then, asked, or demanded. A beat. Plus, you know how she gets when it involves the children. They moved away before I heard anything else. Diane and I didn't look at each other right away. That's the thing about being a professional in spaces like this, you learn not to react visibly. You process. You file. You wait. But, I felt it. That particular alertness that comes when something you've walked past without seeing suddenly comes into focus. She. The pronoun used without explanation, the way people use a name when everyone in the room already knows who they mean. Charlotte. He wrote it all down. By 11, we'd been informed that our access window was closing. Standard procedure, a polite, absolute, non-negotiable courtesy. We packed our equipment, signed out, and were escorted to the main gate. But I stayed in that feeling all the way back to London. Because here's what I knew, pieced together from fragments. Somewhere on those grounds that morning, a guard had filed a written report. That report was about Princess Charlotte. Someone, TBH, the she who demanded rather than merely asked, had requested to see it. And the person who'd heard about that request had used the phrase "you know how she gets when it involves the children." There's, in the whole universe of people that phrase applies to, only one person it could mean. Catherine, Princess of Wales. Kate. The following days, I started pulling threads. Not in any dramatic way. No anonymous for what it's worth, sources dramatically approached me in car parks. No encrypted messages, just the quiet, patient work of asking careful questions of people who'd been in the right rooms at the right times, and listening very carefully to which parts of my questions they chose not to answer. What emerged, slowly, was this: 3 days before our access visit, Princess Charlotte had been on the grounds of Windsor with a small supervised group, a low-key afternoon, the kind that doesn't appear in any official schedule. A recreational visit. Normal, in the context of royal family life. The guard posted near one particular section of the grounds that afternoon, I'll call him by his initial only, which is how he's been referred to in every account I've heard, was Officer D. Officer D had been with the Royal Household Security Detail for a little over 4 years. By all accounts steady, professional, unremarkable in the best possible sense. The kind of person who does the job properly and doesn't seek attention. Sometime during that afternoon, Officer D witnessed something. Whatever it sort of was, he didn't radio it in immediately. He waited until the end of his shift, sat down in the duty room, and wrote a full observational report in longhand. Filed it through the proper channel. Didn't basically discuss it with colleagues. The report sat in the Security Administration office overnight. By the following, morning, Kate had asked for it. Now basically, why would a guard's report about an afternoon on the grounds reach the Princess of Wales within 24 hours? This is the basically question I kept coming back to. Royal Household Security generates paperwork constantly. Reports, logs, incident notations, access records. The vast majority of it never reaches the family directly. There are layers between a duty officer's written account and the people those accounts ultimately concern. Those layers exist for good reason. They create order, filter noise, maintain professional distance. For Kate to have learned about this specific report quickly enough to ask for it the following morning, one of two things had to be true. Either someone in that chain decided she needed to know, or she'd already been told what was in it by someone who was there. I spoke, eventually, to someone I'll describe only as a person who has worked in proximity to the household for a significant stretch of time. Not a current employee. Not someone with any obvious reason to embellish. They told me pretty much, carefully, in the measured way of someone who has spent years being precise, that the report described an interaction involving Charlotte that Officer D considered unusual enough to document formally rather than simply note verbally. Unusual how? I asked. Unusual in the sense that it was unexpected, they said. Kind of, not dangerous. Not alarming in a security sense, but the kind of thing. They paused. The kind of thing that, if you were a parent, you'd want to know about. And, if you were that particular parent, you'd want to see the original account. Kind of, not a summary. Not a verbal relay. The actual words. Because she'd want to judge it herself, I said. Because she always wants to judge things herself when it comes to her children, they said. That hasn't changed. To be fair, what strikes me, thinking about all of this, is the image of Kate sitting down with that report. Not a courtier reading it to her. Not a summary memo. The actual page, pretty much in Officer D's handwriting, describing what he saw. People who know, I think, Kate, not casually, but genuinely, consistently describe a specific quality in her that gets underestimated because it's housed in someone whose public image is so carefully composed. A precision. Plus, an insistence on primary sources. When something concerns her children, she doesn't accept filtered information. She goes to the origin point. She asked for the report. Then, the accounts I've gathered, she read it twice. And, after the second reading, she sat quietly for a moment that the person present described as, and I'm using their word, uncharacteristic. Not upset. Not visibly shaken. Just very, very still. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I don't have, the report. I've never seen it. Nobody handed me a copy, and I wouldn't reproduce one if they had. What I've is a picture assembled from fragments from people who were nearby, people who heard about it afterward, and one person who knows more than they'll say directly but who has, in their own careful way, pointed me toward the shape of it. That shape is this, Officer D witnessed Charlotte doing something that palace staff didn't expect. Something that, in itself, wasn't dangerous or upsetting. But something that carried enough weight, emotional weight, symbolic weight. That a 4-year veteran of royal security felt compelled to write it down in full rather than simply let the shift end. Let me tell you what I've been able to piece together about that afternoon. And, then, I'll tell you what I believe was in that report. The afternoon in question began at around 2 o'clock. Windsor Great Park has sections that are kept particularly private, not the public walking areas. Interior ground, paths that thread between older structures, gardens that don't appear in any visitor map. Charlotte, along with what I understand was a small group of 2 or 3 others, at least one of whom was a member of household staff and one a person I'll describe simply as a family friend's child of similar age, was given what sounds like a free-range couple of hours. Low supervision. High trust, the kind of afternoon that children remember without knowing why. Officer D, for what it's worth, was posted at one of the boundary points of this area. His role was essentially perimeter. He wasn't following the children, wasn't monitoring them in any intrusive sense. He was simply present at a fixed point, maintaining a watch on the outer edge of the space they were moving through. From his position, he had a clear sightline to a particular section of the grounds, a stretch of older garden near what I'm told is a small stone structure, possibly a folly or a converted outbuilding of some kind. Ornamental. Not used for anything functional. That's where he honestly saw what he saw. According to the person who described the report's contents to me, and I want to emphasize again that this is a second-hand account, interpreted and filtered through someone who themselves may have only heard a version Charlotte had separated slightly from the others. Not worryingly so. Just that natural drift that happens when children are in open space and feel safe. The others had moved toward a different section of the garden. Charlotte was near the stone structure. And she was talking, and Officer D initially assumed she was on some kind of device. Children occasionally have tablets or phones in those settings. He adjusted his attention and standard awareness check. But she wasn't on a device. She was talking to herself. And, in my opinion, this is the part that apparently made Officer D pause long enough to look properly, she was talking to someone who wasn't there. Not in the dreamy, distracted way of a child narrating a game to themselves. With direction. With pauses, as though listening for a response. With the specific body language of a person in conversation, the slight tilt of the head, the small gestures, the way the weight shifts from one foot to the other when you're explaining something. She spoke for what Officer D estimated at 3 to 4 minutes. Then, she stopped. looked at the space she'd been addressing, said something short he couldn't catch the words from his distance. And then, she turned and walked back toward the others as if nothing particular had happened. Now, I know what you're thinking, because it's what I thought. Children do honestly this, which children have imaginary friends, they talk to absent grandparents, they invent games with invisible companions. It is one of the most ordinary things in the world. A child talking to empty air is not news. It is not a matter of security, and it is barely worth noting. But here's what makes Officer D's decision to write it down slightly more explicable. It wasn't that she was talking to no one. It was who he believes she was talking to. I'm going to tread carefully here, because this is where the account becomes something more than a quirky anecdote and starts to carry the kind of emotional weight that I think explains Kate's stillness after reading it. Officer D, to be fair, his report, apparently described hearing Charlotte use a specific form of address, not a name he didn't recognize, not a made-up title, but a word that anyone working in proximity to the royal family would know immediately. He wrote it actually down because of that word. Because the word wasn't ambiguous. Because it wasn't the kind of word a child uses carelessly or accidentally. The word, as it's been described to me, was Grandpa. I'll give you a moment with that. King Charles III, Grandpa Wales, as he was called by the younger grandchildren, or simply Grandpa in the casual register of family, died in circumstances that the public knows broadly. His illness was documented, its progression followed. His passing honestly left a particular kind of loss at the center of that family, not just the public grief, but the private kind, the kind that belongs to children who were too young to fully process what's gone but old enough to feel where the space used to be. Charlotte was close to him. That much is known. There are photographs that tell that story without needing explanation, the way she leaned against him, the particular ease of her body language in his presence, the shared expressions caught across rooms at public engagements. She was old enough to understand he was gone. Young enough that the understanding doesn't always hold. What Officer D wrote in his report, apparently, wasn't a clinical observation. It was a duty report, yes, formal, professional, following the required format. But, within that format, he apparently found the space to note that the interaction he'd witnessed had the quality of someone who was genuinely speaking to a presence they felt, regardless of whether that presence was physical. He noted that Charlotte did not seem distressed. He noted that she seemed, and this word was apparently used explicitly, settled. As though the conversation had given her something. He noted that when she walked away, she was smiling. And he noted, in what I'm told was the final line before his signature, that he had hesitated before writing any of this down at all, and had ultimately decided to document it because it seemed like the kind of thing that the people who loved her should know. That line. The kind of thing that the people who loved her should know. That is not standard security report language. That is a for what it's worth, human being, doing a professional job, choosing to extend beyond the job's literal requirements because something moved him enough to make him want to. For years in royal protection. Presumably hundreds of uneventful shifts. And, on this particular Tuesday afternoon in autumn, a little girl talking to empty air near a stone garden. Honestly, structure made a man sit down and write in longhand because he thought her mother ought to know. Kate asked for the report. She read it. She read it again. And then, she sat very still. I've thought a lot about what that stillness must have been. Because it could have been so many things. It could have been grief, reignited. The fresh kind that gets dull over time and, then, comes back sharp without warning, triggered by the most sideways evidence of its own existence. It could have been something quieter than grief. A kind of recognition of Charlotte's inner life, of the way children process the enormous things they're given no adequate framework for, of the particular bravery of a 9-year-old girl finding her own way through a loss she didn't ask for. It could have been something close to pride, though that word feels too simple. Or it could have been all of those things, arriving simultaneously, which is how the real feelings come, not one clean emotion but several, folded together, impossible to separate. What I know is that after the stillness, Kate made a decision. She asked to speak with Officer D directly. Not through an intermediary. Not a formal commendation through the proper administrative channel, the kind that results in a letter and a modest ceremony. She asked for him to be brought to where she was. The meeting, from what I've gathered, was brief. 15 minutes, perhaps. Private, just the two of them. I don't know what was said. Nobody who's told me anything about this story was in that room. But Officer D, who, remember, is described as a steady, unremarkable professional in the best sense, came out of that meeting visibly affected. Not distressed. Look, not embarrassed. Just the look of someone who has had a conversation they weren't prepared for, that asked something of them emotionally they hadn't expected to give. One of his colleagues apparently asked him afterward if everything was all right. He said yes. Then, to be fair, he said, she thanked me for the last line. The kind of thing that the people who loved her should know. Kate had read, in my opinion, that line, in a stranger's handwriting, about her daughter, and had thought it important enough to tell the man who wrote it that she was glad he had. I keep returning to the image of Charlotte near that stone structure. The autumn light going thin and golden, and the distant sounds of the others somewhere in the garden. And a 9-year-old girl, tilting her head slightly, pausing as though to let someone speak. There's nothing in that image to explain or resolve. It is simply what it's, which a child keeping a line open to someone she misses. A guard who noticed, and chose to bear witness to it properly. A mother who needed to know, and who made sure she did. A palace communications operate on a principle that most people understand in theory but rarely appreciate in practice. The silence is the message. When something is not confirmed, not denied, not addressed, that absence is not neutral. It is a deliberate architectural feature, which it means, this exists, and it's ours, and we've decided you don't need it. What happened with Officer D's report and Kate's response to it was never acknowledged publicly. No statement. Plus, no briefing. No carefully worded paragraph attributed to a Kensington Palace spokesperson using the standard language of warm management. Nothing. Plus, and that nothing, in the grammar of palace communication, means something. Let pretty much me tell you what happened in the 2 weeks following that meeting. The first thing I noticed, and this is small, but I've learned not to dismiss small things, was a change in how Officer D was being deployed. He hadn't been transferred. Hadn't been reassigned anywhere dramatic. But, honestly, his posting had shifted. Instead of the perimeter duties that are, frankly, the less visible end of royal protection work, he was now being given assignments closer to the family's direct movements. Not the innermost circle, that's a different level of vetting and relationship entirely, but noticeably closer than before. In palace terms, that kind of shift doesn't happen accidentally. It happens pretty much when someone has highlighted a quality that the household values and wants to keep in proximity. The pretty much quality, in this case, was judgment. Specifically, the judgment to know that doing your job correctly sometimes means doing slightly more than your job technically requires. The second thing I noticed was harder to pin down. It was about Kate herself. In the days after the report, she had a scheduled engagement, a fairly routine institutional visit, the kind that generates a few photographs and a brief write-up in the court circular. I wasn't there, but I've spoken to someone who was, and what they described was a version of Kate that felt, in their words, more present than usual. She's always engaged, this person said. Sort of, she's good at it. But, usually you can see the professional layer. The way she's managing the room. That day it wasn't there. Or it was less there. She was, just in it. I asked what they thought had happened. They said, I don't know. Sometimes something reminds you of what matters and it shows for a while. I've been trying to think about what that report actually meant to Kate, beyond the obvious emotional impact. Because here's the thing about being in Kate's position, a position built on almost impossible levels of visibility and scrutiny, on the relentless management of image and information, on being permanently observed and permanently careful. The things you can't control become precious in a very specific way. She can control what photographs get released. She can manage public appearances down to the level of which earrings carry which meaning. She can shape narrative through carefully considered statements and strategic visibility. She can't control what her daughter does when she thinks no one is paying close attention. She can't engineer the private grief of a 9-year-old. She can't choreograph a child's way of staying connected to someone who's gone. That afternoon in Windsor, Charlotte did something entirely her own. Raw, unmanaged, unperformed. And the only basically reason Kate knows about it at all is because a man did his job slightly more humanly than required. The report didn't tell Kate anything she could use professionally. It didn't help her figure out any public challenge. It didn't solve anything. It just honestly told her something true about her daughter. In a life built around things that are managed and shaped and considered, that kind of unfiltered truth is almost impossible to come by. No wonder she needed to read it herself. I want to, for what it's worth, spend a moment on Charlotte, because I think she's the quiet center of all of this. She, I think, is 9 years old. She's grown up in a specific kind of glass, observed constantly, expected to hold herself with a composure most adults never achieve, navigating the gap between being a child and being a symbol with a fluency that should honestly be more astonishing than it tends to appear. At look, public engagements, she's recognizably her mother's daughter in that fluency. She knows where to stand, which she knows how to receive a bouquet. She knows when to smile and when to let the smile soften into something realer. The composure is genuine, not brittle. But composure is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of discipline layered over feeling. And, in Windsor, in the thin autumn light, when the others had drifted away and she was near the stone structure and she thought she was alone, the discipline went quiet for a few minutes. Just a few minutes. Just a little girl saying the things she wanted to say to the person she wanted to say them to, in the only way still available to her. There's basically a version of this story that gets sentimental in the wrong way. I want to avoid that. The story isn't sentimental. It's human. There's a difference, and sentimentality wraps things up neatly. It tells you how to feel. It turns a 9-year-old talking to her absent grandfather into a lesson or a symbol or a moment of sweetness designed for consumption. What I'm describing is something rawer than that. A child finding her own way through grief is not sweet. You know, it is not heartwarming. It is a fundamentally lonely act, however, surrounded by people she may be. She is doing it with no guidance, because there's no adequate guidance for it. She is inventing the ritual herself, in the moment, because the need for it outweighs the lack of any established form. That's not sweet. That's brave. And then, there's Officer D, standing at his post, doing his job, watching something unfold that he hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for. He had options. He could have logged the shift and said nothing. It wasn't a security concern, nobody was in danger, nothing required intervention. Most people, in his position, would have done exactly that. He could have mentioned it verbally to a superior and left it there, a brief note in passing, the kind that dissipates before it reaches anyone who matters. Instead, he sat down and wrote it out fully. Described what he saw in enough detail that the description carried not just information but atmosphere, the quality of what he'd witnessed, the sense of it. And he ended with that line. The kind of thing that the people who loved her should know. He was aware, writing that the report might reach Kate. He had to have been. He was aware that he was stepping slightly outside the narrow functional definition of his role and into something more personal, more vulnerable. He did it anyway. Because sometimes the right thing and the professional thing are the same thing, and you just have to be confident enough in your own judgment to know it. Kate's meeting with him, from everything I've been told, reflected that understanding. She didn't make it official. No formal commendation, no ceremony, no public acknowledgement. She met with him privately, briefly, and she thanked him. Specifically, for the content, for the decision to document it, and for the last line. In the context of that world, a private thank you from the Princess of Wales for something done quietly and, well, is not a small thing. It is, in its own way, the exact right response to the exact right action, contained, personal, proportionate. It said, I see what you did. Plus, I understand why. I mean, it mattered. I've been sitting with this story for several weeks now, turning it over, trying to understand what draws me back to it. Part of it's the particularity. The specific detail of a guard's handwriting, a stone structure in an autumn garden, a child's body language, a mother's stillness. These things aren't general, they aren't symbolic. They are just themselves. Part of it's the chain of small decisions that allowed the moment to travel from Charlotte to Kate at all. Charlotte choosing to, in my opinion, be in that part of the garden. Officer D choosing to look when he didn't have to. Officer D choosing to write when he could have stayed silent. Someone in the household deciding Kate needed to know. Kate insisting on the original document rather than a summary. Remove any one of those decisions and the moment stays private to Charlotte alone, lived and, then, dissolved, known only to her and whoever she believed she was speaking to. Instead, it made it to her mother. The palace, as honestly, I said, has said nothing about any of this. Some things are protected not by denial but by the specific gravity of their own privacy. This is one of them. And I think Kate would have it exactly that way. She didn't ask for the report because she wanted to manage the situation. She didn't ask because she was alarmed or concerned. She asked because she's Charlotte's mother, and a guard had witnessed something true about her daughter. She needed to know the truth in his words, not someone else's approximation of them. That's not a royal impulse, that's a parent's impulse. It's possibly the most ordinary thing in this entire story. Which is maybe why it's the thing that stays with me. I went back to Windsor once more, about a week after I'd assembled most of this account. It was early morning, still dark at the edges, the kind of cold that comes up through the soles of your shoes. I stood near the main gate and watched the first of the day's staff arrive, the security rotation change, the quiet professional machinery of the place starting up. I thought about Officer D standing at his post in the October afternoon. I thought about Charlotte near the old stone structure, tilting her head, pausing, listening for something in the silence. I don't know honestly what she heard. Plus, I don't think that's mine to know. But I know that someone saw her, and chose to witness it properly, and that it found its way to the person who needed it most. Sometimes that's all a moment needs. Someone to see it. Someone to write it down. Plus, someone to understand that certain things are worth more than the job technically requires, that the last line of a duty report can be the truest sentence in the building. Charlotte walked back for what it's worth, through the autumn garden, and she was smiling. And, somewhere on the other side of that, Kate read about it in a stranger's handwriting, and sat very still, and felt whatever she felt. And that, I think, is enough.